We're going to have some fun in this tutorial exploring negative painting, wet on wet, and splattering. Today we're going to paint sand dollars using a negative painting technique. This is an easy and fun way to create a stylized watercolor. What is negative painting? Negative painting is when you paint the space around an object to define its shape. With watercolor, you can use multiple layers of negative painting to create depth and the illusion of stacked or layered objects. Here's a simple example with starfish. First, paint the entire space around the top starfish to define its shape. After that layer dries, paint the background again going around the top two starfish, which defines the second starfish. With negative painting, you can use the same paint value and consistency for each layer. Because you're glazing layer upon layer, the value builds up. You can repeat that process to add more starfish. You can achieve really dark background colors without having to paint with a thick, dry mix of paint. For that reason, negative painting and glazing are my favorite techniques for building up rich, saturated color. Once the shapes are defined, you can go back and add color or details onto the objects themselves. I recommend adding more detail on the objects that appear closer and less detail on the objects that appear further away. In this video, you'll discover how to use the negative painting technique to paint these sand dollars. Instead of painting a solid background, you'll learn a wet on wet technique to create a background vignette around the sand dollars. I'll also show you a few simple ways to add texture to the background. For this painting, you'll need 100% cotton watercolor paper. I use and recommend Arches cold press 140-pound paper. 100% cotton paper is essential for this tutorial because we're going to do several wet on wet layers. I use Holbein soft tape to tape my paper to a plexiglass panel. For paint, I will be using Turquoise Blue by Holbein and Phthalo Blue by Daniel Smith. I will be using the paints from my pans, not the tubes, so don't worry if you only have pans. You can use any blues that you like. For brushes, you need one large brush for applying clean water. The Princeton Neptune 1-inch Mottler brush is my favorite for wetting paper. I only use it for applying clean water. You'll also want two round brushes. I used a Princeton Neptune size 8 round brush and a Princeton Heritage size 2 round brush. Okay, these last two supplies are optional but add so much to the finished painting. First is masking fluid. I used PBO drawing gum to preserve white splatters in the background. You'll need a cheap brush dedicated to masking fluid and a cup of soapy water to clean the brush. Second is a dip pen. I love using a dip pen for mark making. You can create extra fine details with a nib that are hard to create with a small brush. I put links to all of the supplies in the description below. You also need the sand dollar drawing. There's a link to the line drawing in the description so you can trace the design and paint with me. After you transfer the line drawing to your watercolor paper, cut out the drawing to use as a mask for splattering. Start by splattering masking fluid on the background using a small brush. You'll see at the end the sparkle that this gives the finished piece. My favorite way to splatter is by loading my brush with masking fluid and then tapping it onto another brush. Keep a towel handy to wipe up splatter that goes beyond your paper. Set the paper mask aside to use again later. When the masking fluid is dry, you're ready to paint the first layer. In the first layer, you want to start building up the background color and texture using a wet on wet technique to create a soft vignette. Pre-wet your paper with clean water. Carefully paint the clean water around the sand dollars and bring the water out to the edges of the paper. Don't get any water on the sand dollars. You want them to stay dry. To extend the working time, I like to wet the paper 3 times so it has a nice even gloss. Then, load your brush with a watery mix of turquoise paint and dab it along the wet edges around the sand dollars. Watch the paint spread on the wet paper. The paint will only travel where the paper is wet. You can tilt your board slightly to direct the flow of paint. Don't try to cover the entire background. Instead, let the paint flow and create a soft vignette behind the sand dollars. It's so fun watching the paint flow. Keep adding paint until you're happy with the background shape. You can add dabs of paint trailing off towards the corners to create more texture in the background. As you add paint, you can also use your brush to pull the paint up to the edges of the sand dollars. Sometimes there's a small gap or a spot that you missed when wetting the paper. If the paint starts spreading too fast, you can carefully blot it with a tissue, but don't do it too much or you might get some hard edges when the paint dries. Now, let your paper dry completely. You can use a hairdryer to speed up the drying process, but I would let it dry naturally for about 15 minutes first. That way the pigment has a chance to finish spreading. When using a hairdryer, don't hold it too close to the paper and keep it moving around the painting until the entire paper is dry. When your paper is taped down to a board, it should go back to flat once it's dry. If the paper feels cool to the touch, it's not dry yet. Continue drying until it no longer feels cool. Also, check your tape. If it lifts from the heat, let it cool and then press it back down. Now it's time to start the negative painting to define each sand dollar. Start with the 2 full sand dollars that appear on top. First, use a small brush to paint the details inside those 2 sand dollars. Use the same watery turquoise mix to paint inside the keyholes and to paint the petal-like shapes on the top of each sand dollar. Only do this on those top 2 sand dollars. Now you need to wet the background again, except this time you're going to wet everything except the top 2 sand dollars. After you've wet the paper 2 or 3 times, start adding paint around the top 2 sand dollars and let it bleed out. This will create a shadow between the top sand dollars and the other ones below them. If the paint is spreading too far, you can clean and dry off your brush so it's barely damp, then use it to smooth out the spreading paint. Just don't do that too much or you'll start lifting the paint. Let this layer dry completely. If you're enjoying this video and want to see more watercolor tutorials like this, please subscribe to my channel. Time for the 3rd layer. You're going to negatively paint around the next 2 sand dollars. First, paint the details on the top of the sand dollars. Use the same turquoise paint to fill in the keyholes and paint the petal-like shapes on top. Then re-wet your paper everywhere except the 4 sand dollars that have painted details. Painting those inside details is a good reminder of which sand dollars should stay dry and that you want to paint around. Once the paper is evenly wet, drop in more turquoise paint around the edges of the dry sand dollars. You can add more pigment in the corners where the sand dollars meet. Paint all the way around the new sand dollars to create the shadow on the sand dollars below. Let this layer dry completely. You're ready for the last wet on wet layer. First, paint the details on the top of the last 3 sand dollars. Wet your paper again, this time going around all of the sand dollars. To maximize the working time when you're painting, I recommend wetting the paper 3 times until it has a nice even gloss. Then drop in some more turquoise paint around the sand dollars. You can put it in the corners first between the sand dollars and then work outwards. Make sure to go all the way around the bottom 3 sand dollars. To increase the contrast and add more depth, you can mix in a darker pigment. Turquoise can't go any darker on its own, so I added some phthalo blue. Again, drop it in at the corners first and then work it around the edges. You can also add drops of the phthalo blue around the background. You can target those masking fluid dots that you splattered on earlier. Make sure each dot is surrounded by a spot of color. Let this layer dry completely before moving on to the finishing details. Now you get to explore mark making to finish off your sand dollars. I decided to use my dip pen to create small dots along the petal shapes on the top of each sand dollar. You can add small lines, hashes, or whatever mark you love to decorate your sand dollars. To use a dip pen with watercolor, load up your brush with paint and then brush it on the back side of the nib. I refilled my nib with watercolor after each sand dollar. If you don't have a dip pen, you can use a small detail brush for this step. But I highly recommend getting a dip pen. It's so fun to use for fine details. I'll link to the nib and holder that I use in the description. You can see I'm just tapping the tip of the nib on the paper to create the dots. If you're using a tiny brush for this, you're going to have to reload it often. A nib can hold more watercolor than a small brush, so I was able to add all of the dots for one sand dollar before reloading the nib. Sand dollars also have 4 dots in the center, which you can add with the dip pen too. The last thing you need to do is darken the keyholes to match the background. You can use phthalo blue to paint another layer over all of the keyholes. Let this layer dry completely. Once your mark making is dry, it's time for a little more splattering. Put your paper mask back over your sand dollars. You can also cover the white corners of your painting with paper towel or scrap paper to avoid getting splatter there. This time, splatter with phthalo blue paint to add some dark specks to the background. Once the splatter is dry, use a masking fluid eraser to remove the masking fluid you splattered at the beginning. After you think you have it all removed, rub your finger over the paper to make sure you got all the fine dots. Now your background has sparkly white speckles and dark blue speckles. This was such a fun painting. I love working wet on wet, and the negative painting technique adds a lot of depth to the finished piece. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and give this painting a try. Please subscribe to my channel. I share watercolor tutorials just like this one every week.